Welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Today is Monday, April 7th, day 549 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda. Good to be with you.
Where am I finding you today? Can you tell the listeners?
I can. I'm currently in Abu Dhabi for a conference. I think a lot of different Middle East leaders are in town. Conference is thrown a little bit off kilter as a result of Prime Minister Netanyahu's last-minute decision to travel to Washington. So some of the people who are supposed to be here in Abu Dhabi are actually now in Washington. Maybe they'll come back in time for the end of the conference on Tuesday. But that's where I am currently for the next couple of days.
Yeah, and obviously, had we known about the trip, you would have been in Washington, D.C. rather than Abu Dhabi as our U.S. Bureau Chief. But instead, Laser Behrman is fielding all the coverage, and so check out our live blog for more updates on that. Now, today, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will meet U.S. President Donald Trump at about 1 p.m. local time, so that's a prime time television in Israel time. And the two leaders are expected to discuss the new tariffs Trump imposed on Israel, potential tensions between Israel and Turkey in Syria, efforts to roll back Iran and its proxy network, and hostage talks, of course, with Hamas. So Jacob will fill us in on this spontaneous-ish trip and what Netanyahu hopes to accomplish. We'll then turn to a really fascinating interview that Jacob conducted with a senior Palestinian official about Hamas's so-called, at least, willingness to end the war. And we'll end with a butterfly named after the murdered hostage, Ariel Bibas. All this and more when we're back. Just an update, Israel experienced the largest barrage of rockets from the Gaza Strip last night as 10 missiles were fired by Hamas towards the coastal city of Ashdod. The IDF says that 5 of the 10 rockets launched from Gaza's Deir al-Balech area were intercepted by air defenses. At least one of the 5 unintercepted rockets hit Ashkelon, also a coastal city, causing damage and injuring 1 man. Now, Jacob, let's turn to this trip to Washington, D.C. And as I mentioned, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is expected to meet today with President Donald Trump and probably U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. He met last night with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutkoff. So this is Netanyahu's second trip to the state since Trump's reelection, and it came as a bit of a surprise, at least to me. I don't know about to you, because even just a couple of days ago, the idea was hinted at, but then there are also ideas that it would be in a week or in 2 weeks or after Passover. So what can you tell us about the spontaneous nature of this trip?
You're right. This did catch a lot of people off guard. If you remember, Netanyahu was just in Washington at the beginning of February. So about 2 months ago, he became the first foreign leader to make a trip to the White House and meet President Trump. But then a few days ago, when Prime Minister Netanyahu was in Hungary for a visit with Prime Minister Viktor Orban, he and Netanyahu got on the phone with Trump, and they mainly discussed Hungary's decision to pull out of the International Criminal Court, something that the U.S. and Israel both welcomed very much so, given the targeting that the court has used of Israel and potentially of the U.S. as well. And during that call, the U.S. president also talked about his tariff regime and talked about a potential visit of Prime Minister Netanyahu to the White House. Now, my understanding is during that call specifically, there was no date about when it might happen. But Trump, when he's speaking to reporters several hours after that call, he says, yeah, actually, Netanyahu is going to be coming here, very well might likely be coming next week. And that had quite a bit of us scrambling to figure out how that could be, given that this trip was he was just in Washington. Is Trump speaking maybe off the cuff? Is he actually planning on having something next week? I spoke with one U.S. Official who said that there hadn't been anything on the books and there wasn't really a plan to have Netanyahu at least for another several weeks at the earliest, given that he had just been in town. But Trump liked the idea, and I think he likes the idea of having leaders come one by one to try to make their case against these tariffs, definitely showing that they're not permanent. The ones that he imposed on Israel, that 17%, was something that very much surprised Israeli officials, given that this was something they were hoping to avoid. They had issued this directive. Bezalel Smotrich removed all tariffs on American products in the hopes that Israel would therefore not be hit with something very significant. But I spoke with a U.S. official after the tariffs were announced, who tried to argue that it was a result of the 17% was a result of intellectual property concerns in the pharmaceutical industry in Israel, and feelings that the U.S. is being ripped off by Israel in this field and wants, I guess, a less of a trade deficit. So that's going to be the subject of some of these talks that Netanyahu has with Trump in the White House today.
So, as you said, one of the main points is the tariffs. And ahead of the meeting today, the Manufacturers Association of Israel presented Netanyahu with an analysis warning of the massive potential hit to the economy from the new tariffs. And according to the document, Israeli exports to the U.S. will take 2.3 billion hit from the tariffs, and that's not including the pharmaceutical industry that you just mentioned. I believe that brings it up to something like $3 billion. So I just wonder how much room for negotiation there is here on the tariffs. I mean, as you said, preemptively, our finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, just sweepingly got rid of all of the tariffs on U.S. imports. So what's going on here? What more can Israel actually do?
Look, I think Trump can be easily influenced by the last person speaking to him in the room, and Netanyahu has a real advantage right now, being the first foreign leader to try and make the case in favor of lowering their tariffs to this specific country. I'm sure as the list gets longer and longer, Trump is going to likely be less receptive to some of these arguments from world leaders. However, he does recognize that there's a lot of support domestically for kind of easing the kind of tariff that he put onto Israel, that he'll get backing from Republicans if he decides to do this. But in general, Israel's playing this or hoping, and it's not just on this issue, but foreign policy more broadly, that it's able to dodge the bullet of some of these more isolationist, or you could say MAGA policies that don't necessarily jive with what Israel's been trying to do, don't jive with the free trade agreement that Israel signed with the U.S. in 1985, at a time where you didn't necessarily think that was going to be the way that the U.S. would look in terms of how it did value the Israeli economy and valued forging relationships, economic relationships with people, not necessarily the strongest economies there, but ones based on shared values and shared economic interests. And this new policy being advanced from the Trump administration is very different from that Reagan era approach. Will a lot of this be shaken up in the next few days and not necessarily look how it did, given how hastily some of these figures that were put together to come up with the exact percentages for each country? Yes, I do think a lot of this is going to change in the coming days. I don't know if that's great for the market to have this constant up and down kind of chaos, but that's kind of the nature of the beast with this Trump administration.
Okay, so a second point that our Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will discuss with your president, Donald Trump, is, of course, the Iran negotiations. And this is a topic very close to Bibi's heart. We have seen him give umpteen speeches at the UN, at every possible situation, talking about the Iran threat. And it seems that Trump is dead set on having direct negotiations with Iran. And in the meantime, of course, Iran is saying a firm no. So I just wonder where Bibi fits into this kind of situation, into this kind of conversation. It is, of course, a topic that is directly affecting Israel in terms of existential threat, etc. But where's Bibi in terms of the advisors to Trump on this Iran issue, do you think?
I think on this issue, again, he's also opposed to the current Trump approach and is trying to gingerly express his concern without upsetting the president. But the idea of having direct talks, which is something that the Trump administration has liked to do with Hamas, if you recall from a couple months ago, but also all of its foreign adversaries, if it believes that almost as an ideological standpoint, that the best way to go about holding negotiations with someone, that even if you don't agree with them, is to have it directly, and that by using intermediaries, it makes it a lot harder to understand what the other side really wants. And therefore, it's been pushing for direct talks. In the case of Hamas, I guess it agreed to step away from those, given the blowback from Israel and even within the Republican Party. But on Iran, you're hearing Steve Witkoff, who's kind of the leader of this file, And others in the administration, including Trump himself, say it's much more effective to try to do this directly. Israel's just concerned that when the room just becomes the U.S. and Iran, it doesn't have as much of a say and influence in these negotiations. Whereas if other mediators are being used, Israel can, it feels, exert more influence and raise its concerns regarding the kind of actions that Iran is taking in the region and demand a much harder line than the U.S. might be willing to advance. And there are different, I think, approaches in the administration. You had Mike Waltz taking a much harder line as the national security advisor in terms of not accepting any sort of Iranian nuclear program, whereas Witkoff talked about more, I think, more moderately speaking about it, is putting it more into a box, almost using rhetoric that you would have heard during the Obama and Biden administrations. Now, if you recall, there was this whole signal scandal, and it's not clearly that Witkoff, or it's not clear that Waltz is the most powerful person right now in the administration after the fallout from that. He's lost a lot of staff in recent days. Then again, Witkoff took a lot of heat for an interview that he did where he talks about some of these Iran issues on Tucker Carlson's show. So there's a lot of different jockeying between the different Trump officials of who's going to win the day. But right now, Trump himself approves this more, I guess you could say, in some ways, more moderate approach, at least in the concept of negotiating directly with Iran, which is something that Israel's concerned about and is something that Netanyahu will raise in his meetings today in Washington.
Okay, let's go to a short break and then we'll discuss the rest of the schedule on the trip. And we're back. Of course, the topic that most Israelis really want Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to raise is the issue of freeing the hostages, the hostage release deal. And it appears to me, Jacob, as you noted, our Prime Minister went from Budapest to Washington, D.C. Of course, we didn't talk about this, but there was a bit of a circuitous route so that if the Wing of Zion plane had to land, he would not land in any of the countries that may arrest him from the ICC warrant. But going from Budapest to Washington, D.C., Netanyahu basically had all of his top advisors with him already. And then we hear as well that Ron Dermer is joining. He wasn't apparently in Budapest with Netanyahu, and he's joining the team in Washington, D.C. And I just wonder, is this going to be a real work meeting? Is there any chance of actually pushing the deal forward when we've been at a stalemate for so long? And part of that picture is actually something that you discussed with a high-ranking Palestinian official. I'm not sure if you can get more specific than that yourself, and the offer that Hamas supposedly has made in which they're saying, hey, end the war, will free all the hostages. So talk to us a little bit about what you think could move forward at this point.
I think Dermer and Netanyahu are coming to Washington to try to get more support for the administration in order to give Israel more time to advance its military pressure campaign against Hamas. It means taking over more and more parts of the Gaza Strip and really squeezing Hamas as much as possible militarily, keeping aid at an absolute minimum going into Gaza. I guess none is going in right now, in the hopes that will lead Hamas to buckle in the talks, something that we haven't really seen. And now we're seeing this large barrage of rockets that were fired into Israel several hours ago. So it doesn't seem to be working right now, but I think that's going to be the message that Netanyahu is going to be going to Washington. Give us more time with this military approach. It's not the approach that the hostage families would like to see, at least for the majority of them. I mean, there's been growing anger from those families about the risks to their loved ones' lives as a result of some of these military operations that have been quite brutal throughout the Strip. But I spoke with this Hamas official about how the group sees its chances for trying to get a deal. And he said something that wasn't completely new. This has been a position that they've felt that they've had from the get-go, which is that we're willing to release all the hostages at once if Israel just agrees to end the war. This is something that they say that they offered very, very early on. Israel was not interested at that point. Hamas was much stronger, and Israel felt it needed to bring down Hamas quite a few notches before even considering that kind of idea. But once again, I thought it was interesting that this Hamas official wanted to reach out, get this message in Israeli media that yes, it might be heard some other places, but not so much in Israeli media that this option is on the table. According to this Hamas official, Israel might feel differently, that it might be duped, but there is this opportunity right now. We can get all the hostages out at once, end the war in exchange. We'd obviously want guarantees, something at the Security Council, the mediators themselves providing guarantees that Israel won't resume the war. But if those guarantees are met, we're willing to just give up all 59 of the hostages right now, including the 24 who are believed to be alive. That hasn't been really accepted by Israel. Israel still feels that if that is done, then Hamas is able to remain in power in some form, even if it's much weaker than it once was. And therefore, Hamas has moved from a position that it hadn't been willing to move on for quite several months, where they said, we're sticking to phase 2 of the deal, which is you get all the remaining living hostages for about 24 of them. And in exchange, we agreed to a full withdrawal of Israeli troops and a permanent ceasefire. Israel isn't interested in that, so they were trying to get a extension of phase 1, which ended on March 1st. And for a long time, Hamas refused. But eventually we saw some Hamas official admitted to me that after really being squeezed and no aid going in and the operations getting really intense, we saw them agree to make their own proposal that he claims it was very similar to what Steve Witkoff had put forward last month, where you have the release of 5 hostages. Israel came back to that phase 1 extension, something that Hamas had claimed it would never do, and said, no, we want 11 hostages. And since that 11 offer, there hasn't really been significant talks after that. Talks are pretty much at an impasse, with Israel sticking at 11, Hamas saying 5, but also Hamas official just saying, by the way, even if you don't want 5, we're willing to do free all the hostages at once for an end to the war. And I would just note that this is something that John Poland, the father of executed hostage Hersh Goldberg Poland, said, look, we don't know. There are a lot of people who say we can't really trust Hamas, but let's at least give them a chance to try. Offer an end to the war. Let's see if they can get 59 hostages all out at once. And if not, then we resume the war. But at least let's give this a chance, is what John Poland is arguing.
Right. And there are many voices who say, okay, Hamas will give us a reason to restart the war at any point. So why not give this a try, leave them in power? Okay, fine. And then the war will restart. This is basically the thrust of a conversation that I had recently with the philosopher Micha Goodman on our What Matters Now podcast channel. But I just want to return to something that I think you said, which was that the Hamas official reached out to you. Is that correct, Jacob?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And so how does that happen? You get some kind of WhatsApp from Hamas or what?
We've spoken before, much earlier in the war. It was a source that hasn't been so responsive for quite a few months, but obviously I guess there was an effort to try to get a message across, and I obviously had my own interest involved in trying to use it to also ask hard questions about how they're looking back at their military approaches as someone who's not based in Gaza right now. And I think there are the people abroad, or maybe you could argue a little bit more moderate or pushing for a deal at times where the leaders in Gaza were not. But it was interesting for him to admit that there's been a change in Hamas's position as a result of Israel's military operations. So then you could argue, well, maybe if Israel just squeezes harder, then this will result in Hamas further buckling. But the risk of that is obviously the lives of the hostages and the amount of time that they do or don't necessarily have in Gaza right now, and the massive amounts of civilians that are also being killed in these strikes on a daily basis in Gaza.
Correct, including women and children, obviously. Let's turn now to a story that was published on Friday. And those of you who are longtime listeners of the Daily Briefing and our What Matters Now podcast, and now, of course, we also have the Friday Focus, will note that my husband is the scientific secretary at the Academy of the Hebrew Language. And on Friday, a story broke that the Academy had changed the name of a butterfly in honor of Ariel Bibas. So I'll give you a bit of a backstory here to the story. So essentially, after the eulogy of Yarden Bibas, after, of course, his wife Shiri and 2 young sons, Ariel and Kfir, were buried in Israel, During this eulogy, Yarden mentioned how much his son Ariel was a nature lover and how much he loved butterflies. Hearing this eulogy, the head of the Academy of the Hebrew Language's Zoology Committee, part of the Hebrew Language Academy's job is to create names for all the flora and fauna that is native to Israel. So the head of this Zoology Committee, her name is Dr. Liat Gidron, suggested, why don't we name an orange butterfly in honor of Ariel Bibas to connect with his orange hair? And in this way, offer a memorial to all the fallen from October 7th and beyond during this war. In the academy, like in any kind of academic bureaucracy, everything has to go through committee. But of course, the academy decided to reach out to the Bibas family and ask them first, are you okay with this idea that we name a butterfly after your son Ariel in honor of all of the fallen hostages and those who died during the war? And the Bibas family returned to them and said, yes, of course, we would be happy for this to happen. It went through committee. And first of all, they had to find which orange butterfly throughout Israel would be perfect for this idea. So the story is that my husband was walking our 3.5-year-old son home from daycare, and he was thinking about all of these different orange butterflies throughout Israel. And all of a sudden, he came upon a name going through the catalog in his head. He came upon a name of a butterfly that was recently actually renamed from a foreign name into Hebrew. And the name of the butterfly was Orange Jerusalem. And it's an orange butterfly with beautiful spots on it. And it's quite common throughout the country, but mostly in Jerusalem. And so they gave it this name, Orange Jerusalem. And my husband thought, Ariel is one of the biblical names of Jerusalem. This is a really easy transition and a great connection, both, of course, to Jerusalem and to Ariel, to the murdered hostage. And so, indeed, it came through all the different committees. And finally, in a full member committee, the name was approved. The family was given a letter announcing the official change of the Orange Jerusalem to Orange Ariel. And then the family decided to announce it to the world. And it's one of those stories. It's a little bit of a touching moment for anyone who has a child who was a butterfly freak and anyone who is just so looking for a little glimpse of light in this very dark moment. So that's the backstory behind the new Bibas butterfly, Orange Ariel. Jacob, thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to reading about your trip.
Thanks for having me, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and edited on video by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other installment in any of our series, the What Matters Now, the Friday Focus, and the Daily Briefing, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.